Good morning, everybody. We're going to wait just a minute to give everybody a chance to join us. We had about 42 people registered, so we have about 22 people in right now. So we'll give another minute or two to see if there's anybody else who joins us. Now we should turn this off. Okay, we'll wait till 10:33 and then we'll get started.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you are all with us. My name is Christina Garcia. I work here for Marshfield Clinic Health System with CECHA. I oversee the Recovery Core programming here. I am one of Jen's co-workers. I'm very excited that she's here with all of us today. She is just a wealth of information and such a great part of our team. So you guys are really in for a lot of information today and a lot of great things. So I'm going to do a short introduction for her, and I'm going to watch the chat for her too. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to ask, and I will try to do my best to monitor it as best as I can. And we'll get any of those questions you have, we'll get them answered for you. So Jen Smith has earned a master's degree of education with a focus in special education from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And she has been working with youth and adolescent for over 20 years. During her career, Jennifer has worked in public school settings, community-based agencies, and now she's here with us at the Marshfield Clinic Health System. So thank you for being here with us. In her current role, she works with the YouthNet after-school programming, serving youth ages 8 to 18 in the Marshfield area. MCHS AmeriCorps after school. She's supporting members placed through the clinic's service area and school and community-based after-school programs and the Wisconsin After School Network, providing training and technical assistance to youth serving agencies statewide. Most recently, Jennifer has expanded her knowledge around adverse childhood experiences, the impacts of trauma, and the interventions youth serving organizations and community agencies can implement to help youth build a positive future. So great things Jennifer is doing, and she's here to share all that with you. So thank you. So I'm going
Christina.
to turn it over to Jen, and she will begin her presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Awesome, thank you. So can everybody see my screen? I'm sharing my PowerPoint. Is that a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Yes, you can see, okay. Awesome, thank you, Mary. I can only see a few of you on my screen right now. So our plan for today is really to do a quick review of the original ACE study and some of the implications of that study. I imagine most of you who are participating in this conversation today already have some familiarity with that, so we're not going to spend too much time or take too deep of a dive on that, but I do think that it kind of helps us set the foundation for the conversation as we move forward. Then we're going to really look at the trauma-informed care principles, what those principles are, and what that might look like in a youth serving organization, a school setting, a community-based organization setting. So there's a number of places, that we can really overlay these principles with our work with youth, and how do we have some of those conversations with those organizations in our community, our schools, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs, libraries, whatever the case may be. I know our primary focus today is really looking at our schools and our local communities. And then we're going to end with a little bit of information that really supports the implementation of trauma-informed care in schools, and what we've seen over the past few years in districts that have implemented these strategies, what their successes have been. And so it kind of gives us a little bit, we're armed with a little bit of information when we start having these conversations in our local communities, and really has some support for why we want to move forward down this road of introducing trauma-informed care in our work with youth and kids. So we're going to start with just some group norms. I think most people who participate in these conversations are really interested in being learners, really have respect for each other, understand really the benefits of working in community and collaboration. And this is, these are some norms that were shared with me when I really had the privilege of presenting in Alaska for their statewide after school conference. And the First Alaskan Institute shared these norms with me. And so I've really adopted them and have used them in each of our presentations, each of my presentations. So, the idea that we're really listening to understand, we're valuing our time together, that we understand this is a space for meaningful conversation. If you have questions, comments, please be open to sharing. You can use the chat box. If you want to unmute and just ask questions, I really would like this to be conversational. Especially as we start moving into what does this look like in practice. I think it's good for us to really think about and process that together as a group. So I'm very much open to questions, comments. So please do that as we move forward. We're going to do a little check-in today, and I'm going to launch a poll. So looking at our CAT mood meter today, how are you feeling? So where are you at today? And we're going to launch this poll. So you are going to select 1 through 9, which CAT reflects your mood as of Wednesday morning on this bitter cold week that we've been having so far. We'll give you about a minute or so to decide how you're doing today. Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds. All right, we're going to end the poll. And it looks like most of us are feeling like Cat 4. Cat 4 looks a little like struggling to get going today. So maybe that's a result of all this cold weather we've had. It's midweek. We're just kind of like, I'm feeling a little bit like Cat 8, I would say. This is a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. I get kind of excited when I have an opportunity to share and have these conversations with people who are also interested in how we can really support youth, and particularly youth that might really be having some difficulties and struggling in our communities. So I'm kind of excited to have that conversation with all of you today. So thanks for taking a minute to kind of check in and fill in our little cat mood meter here. So we're going to start just with a brief summary review of the original Adverse Childhood Experience study. And the original study is really quite old now. It's about 30 years old, took place in the late 90s. And that's kind of horrifying when I say that out loud. But the original study looked at a group of individuals in California who were part of an HMO. And there were 17,000 individuals who ended up participating in this study. And the two physicians, Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti, who were the primary investigators for this study, looked at 10 specific adverse experiences that they had identified and embedded those questions into the standard questionnaire. So when you go to your doctor for your physical and they ask you to fill out, how have you had any illnesses recently and how you're feeling, they embedded these 10 questions into that questionnaire. Those 10 experiences that they were really looking at fall into two categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so the questions read, before the age of 18, had you ever been hit so hard by a caregiver that it left a mark? That was measuring, physical abuse. And so they went through and embedded all of these questions into the questionnaire. After 17,000 patients had gone through and answered these questions, the two investigators then took that information and started looking at what is really, what have we learned from collecting all this data? One of the first things they learned, and that they were really pretty shocked to learn, is that these experiences are really very common, and much more common than they would have anticipated seeing through the data that they collected. So almost 2/3 of the adults who participated in this study had at least one ACE. And they really felt like if these experiences are really this common, we would be having more conversations about it. But really, there's a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of lack of conversation about these experiences that happen in our communities, in our culture overall. And so these are sort of the hidden experiences that people have that really aren't discussed very frequently. What they also found was that about 20%, 1 in 5, reported having 3 or more ACEs. And so again, they were really kind of blown away by the fact that children and our society are walking around with this number of experiences before they turn 18 years old. The other thing that they found was that there's really a relationship between these experiences and later health and wellness in adulthood. So they found what they called a graded dose response. And so really what that means is, an individual who had 0 adverse experiences has a corresponding likelihood of developing diabetes, as an example. Then if an individual has 1 adverse experience, that likelihood of diabetes increases. If they have 2, then that increases. 3, it increases. 4, it increases, right? So as those experiences increase, that relationship also increases in your likelihood in some of these negative long-term consequences. Now, it's not a causal relationship, so it doesn't mean if you have this, then you will definitely have this. It's a risk factor. And what we learned is that corresponds to a significant number of chronic diseases. It also correlates to drug and alcohol use. It correlates to smoking. It correlates to mental health diagnoses. It correlates to suicidality. So we know that as individual children have these experiences, increasing those number of experiences also increases their likelihood of some of these negative long-term outcomes. And so it's really imperative for us to learn what we can do early to help sort of mitigate some of those negative consequences that may may occur as a result of some of these early childhood experiences. And so really that's what we want to look at is, what can we do to really help kids as we encounter them and we see that they may have had some of these challenges early in life. So as we said with the original survey, 60% of adults report having had some of these difficulties during early childhood. About a quarter of children in the United States will have a traumatic event before they turn age 4. And we recently did some work through Marshfield Clinic Health System and Marathon County early childhood providers, delivering some trauma-informed care training to those providers and then doing some follow-up coaching. So what can be done in those early childhood environments to start helping to mitigate some of those possible effects? Knowing that about a quarter of the children that we engage with before age 4 may have had some of these early experiences. And one of the most telling statistics, I think, is 75 to 93% of youth entering the juvenile justice system have been victims of childhood trauma. And so what we're seeing is these children often get caught in this negative spiral where they have challenging behaviors, they are lacking in support systems. And so they start down this, sort of punishment, punitive cycle, which really feeds, the school to prison pipeline that's often brought up in many contexts. And so understanding that many of these children who end up in the juvenile justice system are often children who were victimized early in life. And so they really require some different interventions early to help them to develop some skills and strategies so that they can thrive rather than become sort of victims of this pipeline that lands them in the juvenile justice system and then potentially as adults in a similar situation. So this infographic is from the state of Washington, and it's a high school classroom, but I think that it really helps us to visualize in a classroom of students what the statistics that we talk about on paper and in sort of a theoretical framework look like in a classroom of kids. So if I'm in a classroom with 30 students, what might that data overlaid onto them look like? And almost every state in the country has now done their own ACE research, done their own ACE study, and the results have been pretty consistent across the country. So using this classroom, I think, is relevant and speaks to what we would likely see here in the state of Wisconsin if we were to extrapolate the data. So if we look, this first row is really the only row that has children without any adverse childhood experiences. As you move into the second row, it's 3, and then the little guy on the end is 2, and then as we move through, it's 2, and then 3, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then the one child in the corner is 8. So understanding that in a classroom where we are engaging with these youth, there's a significant number, the overwhelming majority of kids who are sitting in our classrooms on any given day have had at least one of those early adversities, and likely they've had more than one. And so really starting to incorporate that lens when we're working with kids will help us to try and help them to develop the necessary skills to be able to mitigate some of those factors, and for us to have an awareness of what we really need to do to help kids who may have had those early experiences. So looking at this next infographic, I think it really illustrates the top part of the tree is really what the first ACE study was really looking at. It was kind of looking at those individualized experiences. So domestic violence, substance use, emotional and sexual abuse, like depression in the household, right? Neglect, divorce, mental illness, all of those were part of the original 10 questions. But we've learned over the years since this original study took place that trauma and adversity is much more expansive than just those 10 discrete experiences. And so when we look at poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunities, violence in our neighborhoods, poor housing, all of those really contribute to ongoing chronic toxic stress, which have similar impacts on us as human beings, right? That underlying ongoing stress really has a similar impact on us and our nervous system, especially as children, as we are growing and developing. You know, our brain goes through incredible growth in those first 3 years. And so the impacts of just this underlying ongoing community stress has very similar experiences. And so we've really broadened our understanding of adverse childhood experiences, that it's not simply those 10 that were present in the original study, but it really is much more broadly recognized. And so we understand that there are entire communities where individuals growing up in those communities are really struggling with this ongoing kind of chronic toxic stress. And how do we help to mitigate some of those experiences of individuals who are living in those areas, in those communities? So any questions? I mean, and that was really our brief, 15-minute review of the original ACE study. Any questions, comments, thoughts at this point before we kind of jump into the neurobiological response of stress on us as humans?
Jen, we did have one question in the chat when you were speaking about
Okay.
the diabetes and things like that. She said, are you speaking of type 2 diabetes? I do not think type 1 diabetes is related to the ACE study.
That's a great question. That's very, very specific question. So yes, it would be type 2, right? Adult onset is increases with the increased presence of early adversity, right? I didn't include a lot of graphs on the correlation between the early adversity and later disease. I thought, that was a little bit less relevant. We really were talking today, focusing much more on what do we do about it. But there is quite a bit of information and data out there, particularly on the CDC site, if you are interested in more specifics around the correlation between adverse childhood experiences and these chronic diseases. You can really look at what the percentage increases are for each particular chronic disease based on the original research. So if you're interested in that, I would say there's a lot of information out there that you can look to give you some more insight on. Any other questions? All right. So we're going to take a quick look at stress and what stress does to the body, and why these adverse experiences really are so challenging for us, and why they have such long-lasting impact on us as individuals as we move through life. So Christina, I'm going to ask people to use the chat. So hopefully they do that, and you can just kind of read out what people put in the chat. But what I want you to think about is when I'm in a stressful situation, and I tend to use this image of a bear as sort of a means of triggering our thought process about this. What happens if I'm out hiking in the woods and I round a bend and I come across a bear, right? So what is going to happen to me? What is my brain and my body response to seeing a bear in the woods if I'm out hiking one day? So you can just plop those into the chat box. What's going to happen to me as an individual when I see this bear in the woods?
Fight or flight, heart starts racing. Yep. Good.
Okay, absolutely. So I'm gonna have a fight or flight response. My heart rate's going to increase. What else is going to happen? I may freeze. Yep. I start to panic. Yes, that's part of that whole heart racing.
Fear, good one.
What else
Fear.
happens to me? Fear.
Might
Yes.
faint. I
Try
like
to
the
figure
might
out what to
faint.
do. I might faint.
Stress hormones.
Yes.
Can't breathe.
Yes. So stress hormones. Mm-hmm. All right, so those stress hormones, specifically adrenaline and cortisol, right? And we've probably heard of those stress hormones. The adrenaline and the cortisol get dumped into our bloodstream, and they are going throughout our body system to help us to prepare to either fight or flee, right? Or potentially freeze, right? Our breathing might get more shallow, right? So we might start having more shallow breathing. Our heart rate starts to increase. And the reason that our heart rate is increasing is because it's pumping blood to our major muscles, major muscle groups in our body. So our arms, our legs, it's getting us prepared, right, for that fight or flight. If I were hungry, am I still going to be thinking about food after I round the bend and I see a bear? I might need to change. There's a funny comment. Yes, I might, have this response that I really don't have control over, right? The blood is going to my major muscle groups. If I was hungry when I was rounding the bend, I'm not hungry anymore. If I was thinking about having a little headache, I don't have that headache anymore, right? All of those other sensations get shut down. Sort of the non-essential body systems kind of go offline so that my major muscle groups can really take all of those resources to help me out in this situation. This is the most interesting piece, I think, in our stress response, is what happens in our brain. Does anybody know what happens in our brain when these stress hormones get dumped into our bloodstream and our body starts to prepare for this fight or flight response? I don't see any comments or hear any comments. Something with cortisol, yes. So what happens, I mean, I like to use Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. I do this with kids to help them learn about how their own brain works. And this thumb that goes across my palm is this lower part of my brain. This is our survival brain, our limbic brain, our emotional brain, right? This is the lower part of our brain. This is the most primal part of our brain that is designed to keep us alive. And this part that comes over and around is our prefrontal cortex, right? So this is our thinking brain, and the prefrontal cortex is right behind our forehead, so right here. This part is really responsible for decision making, long-term planning. It has all of our executive functions. So as stimuli comes in, we kind of decide what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. And as part of this stress response, as part of this dumping of the stress hormones and all of the changes that are taking place in our body, what happens in our brain is we lose access to this higher functioning thinking brain. And we move into this survival, more primitive, emotional brain. And this brain doesn't have the luxury of thinking about the pros and cons and what's going to be the best response. This part of our brain is highly reactive, and it reacts to whatever the stimulus is in our environment. So we're not really going to think about what to do when we see a bear, right? We're going to have this dump of all these stress hormones, our heart rate's going to increase, our pupils dilate, right? Our senses get heightened. If we were hungry, we're not hungry anymore. We're going to lose access to our thinking brain, and we're going to run, or we're going to try and fight if we think that's, not if we think, if our survival brain determines that that's our best option. Or we may freeze, right? So, if it's determined that it's in our best interest to kind of drop and play dead, right? That would be the freeze response. So if I have this whole stress response and I have all this going on, and I manage to get back to my house or get back to the lodge, and I get inside and I close the door and I'm safe, what do I think is going to happen to my body and my brain once I'm in that sort of safe space? What's going to happen to me? You could put this in the chat or unmute and just share out what you think. So I'm back in my home, I'm back in the lodge.
Brain goes to mush. Fatigue.
Okay.
I like the brain goes to mush.
Fatigue, okay. Yeah. It's kind of like this letdown, right? After I had all this heightened, I kind of go, oh.
May
Right,
start to calm down and be able to think. Yeah. Relax, take a deep breath.
Absolutely.
I think
Yes.
I would
So I
feel
moved
like,
from that-
oh my God, it had to have been an angel to protect me. Oh, it's got to be a God somewhere for me to get out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're thinking, right? You engage that brain where now you're processing what happened. Oh my gosh, that was a horrible situation. I can't believe I made it. Someone must have been looking out for me, right? That brain has really re-engaged and you're starting to process how terrifying that situation was that you just encountered, right? And you are able to take some deep breaths. You don't have that shallow breathing. Your heart rate starts to calm down. So basically your body starts to come back online and you achieve more of what is your baseline, right? You're calm. I'm achieving my baseline. Now, this whole system, is part of our biology on purpose, right? It is designed to keep us alive when we are in situations that threaten our individual safety and autonomy. And it's really meant to only happen occasionally, right? It's designed for us to have a highly stressful situation. Rarely, when we have that situation, it's designed to keep us safe. And then we return to baseline. We kind of process the situation and we move through our day, our lives, right? Without this being a common occurrence. So the reason that the adverse childhood experience is so powerful is because individuals who live in environments of chronic toxic stress, of chronic abuse, neglect, or individuals who've had, a singular traumatic event that was significant and really impacted them as an individual, what happens is we have this dump of hormones in our body. We lose access to this thinking brain, and we are challenged to return to baseline. So if I have, an abusive caregiver in my home, every time I encounter that caregiver, my body goes into this neurobiological response, right? I have a stress response every time because I never know what to expect. I don't know if this person is going to be nice to me, if they're going to hit me. I don't know if I'm going to have food to eat or if I'm not going to have food to eat. I don't know if I go out in my community, if there's going to be violence in my neighborhood or not. And so all of those experiences compounded cause me to spend more of my time in my survival emotional limbic brain and less of my time in this prefrontal cortex thinking brain. And so it becomes more and more difficult for me to return to that sort of calm baseline space, right? And that really has some pretty significant impacts on how I walk through life. So Dr. Bruce Perry has this great graphic, and it seems, like a little cluttered at first view. But if you look at the bottom row with the mental state, this really helps me to kind of articulate and to really start to shift my lens when I'm thinking about kids who might be having these ongoing challenging experiences. So if we look at the far left mental state, calm, right? Calm is the mental state I'm in, when I'm doing an activity that I really enjoy. I'm reading a book on a Sunday afternoon by the fireplace. and I lose track of time, right? Or I really enjoy hiking in the woods, or I really enjoy making jewelry, or I really enjoy woodworking. And I really just get absorbed in that activity. I lose track of time. I become much more creative in this space. That's a calm mental state. That's what the calm mental state feels like. And we're not in the calm mental state all that often, but when we do engage in those types of activities, when we engage in mindfulness or meditation, and sometimes when we do some activity like exercise, if we're doing yoga, we're listening to music, those are some opportunities to allow us to move into that calm mental state. That calm mental state is really kind of a mental state that helps us to regenerate and to re-energize. And some of those activities are really part of what we think of self-care, giving our brains and our bodies time to be in that calm mental state. The next state as we move up the continuum is alert. And alert is the best mental state for learning. So we have the ability to kind of take in information, process it internally. Our brain has time to kind of put it in an organized manner so that we can file it away later when we're sleeping. And so then we can retrieve that information as we move forward, day to day after that. So that alert mental state is where we really want to be when we're learning something new. So when we think about kids in school, this is really where we want them to be. Calm and alert are both internally focused mental states. So I am internally focusing on myself. My brain is really processing and thinking, and I'm really focused on what's coming in and processing and keeping that all within my own brain. The next mental state is alarm. And alarm is when something happens in my environment that causes me to shift from being internally focused to being focused on what's going on in my environment around me. So if I'm in a classroom, as an example, and I'm working on an assignment or an activity, I'm taking a test, and I'm really in that alert mental state, I'm processing, I'm thinking, I'm focused, and I hear a door slam and yelling in the hallway, I am now going to stop focusing on what I'm working on, and I'm going to shift my focus to what's going on around me. That's the shift from alert to alarm. And so now I'm in this alarm mental state where that emotional limbic brain is starting to come online. It's starting to say, hey, there's something going on around me that I think I might need to pay attention to, because my job is to keep this human being safe and alive, right? And so that we're starting to shift, we're starting to slowly move out of this prefrontal cortex thinking brain and move down into this emotional survival brain. So if I continue to move up the continuum, and I think someone said when we were talking about the bear, I experience fear, right? And that's exactly right. As I move up the continuum, the next mental state is fear. And so if I heard that door slam and yelling, and now I hear people yelling and shouting, it's going to continue to escalate my emotional state, right? I'm really going to continue to move up. And then if I hear alarms going up and announcements that I need to evacuate the building, it's going to move up here, right? And I'm going to be purely in this reflexive, really kind of survival emotional brain. And that's going to be the whole fight or flight response that's designed to keep me safe and keep me alive. So one of the very interesting things that Dr. Bruce Perry discovered in his work with kids who have had early traumatic experiences is, as a result of these early ongoing experiences, many kids live in that alarm mental state, that becomes their baseline. So kids with those early adversities really struggle to shift into those more internally focused mental states, where they struggle with focus, with taking in information and processing it so it can be stored later when I'm sleeping.
it's very difficult for them to be in a calm mental state where I'm not focused on my external surroundings much at all, but I'm really focused on a specific activity and I kind of go into this flow mental state. So children who've had these early adversities really struggle to be in those two mental states. And so think about the two major things that happen in both of those mental states. One, we do our best learning, and two, it helps us to re-energize and restore. So if I'm a child who's living in alarm most of the time, I am not at my best trying to learn new things, and I'm really not having many opportunities to re-energize and restore myself, my brain and my body. And so I become hyper alert, hyper vigilant, right? I'm really always focused on what's going on around me and very rarely focused on what's going on inside of me. And the other piece that Dr. Bruce Perry discovered is that many children with early adversity have a higher resting heart rate than children who have not had those adversities. And so it has a biological impact. Our bodies respond differently. So over time, not only do our organs and our body systems react differently, our brain also reacts differently. And it becomes more difficult for us to create strong pathways to this prefrontal cortex, this thinking brain. Those pathways are I think about a path through a field, right? And as I go follow that path over and over, it becomes well-worn. But when I'm first trying to create that path, I'm, going through knee-high weeds and it's really challenging. That's really what happens for kids who are in this alarm mental state, who are not accessing this prefrontal cortex very often. Those pathways are like trying to go through knee-high weeds, right? They're not clean, clear, well-worn pathways because I don't have the opportunity to practice those pathways very frequently because I'm so often focused on what's going on around me. So what is really, the implication? What are we going to see in school? So what do we see from kids? So this is, very often what we are likely to see. We are likely to see kids who maybe act out, right? So they overreact to mild threats. They're very easily triggered. We talk often about kids who go from 0 to 60 at the drop of a hat, right? Like we were just lining up and all of a sudden he's, hitting somebody. The reality is the kids are not going from 0 to 60. The kids are already at 40 because they're living in that alarm mental state. They're already hypervigilant about what's going on around them. And so it takes fewer external triggers to get to 60, right? Because their nervous system is already sort of on this alert all of the time. We also have kids who may act in. And those are the kids that are often overlooked because they're not disruptive and they're not really a problem. But really, they have a tendency to zone out and not engage. And so, they really kind of dissociate as a way of dealing with their environment. So they have, these stressors in their environment. And so they tend to freeze, right? So they act in and they kind of shut down. Their body goes into freeze as a way to cope with the overwhelming stress and the perceived threat to themselves. Kids often who've had some of these early experiences, particularly neglect, may have smaller brain volume. They may have difficulty, with their own behavior, developing adequate coping skills. They tend to be hyper aroused, as I said. They have difficulty with memory and compartmentalizing, and that really makes sense, right? If that alert mental state is where I learn best, and I am almost never in that alert mental state, I'm really going to struggle with learning and memory, right? And compartmentalizing. I'm going to have difficulty with paying attention and having learning difficulties. And I'll tell you, as a former special education teacher, how I wish I knew some of these things when I was working with kids who have learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disabilities, because this knowledge would have really improved how I interacted with the kids that I managed on my caseload each year in special education. I did the best I could with the information I had at the time, but boy, knowing this really would have been powerful information. So what we need to realize is that being born human doesn't ensure we're going to be humane, right? Humane is caring, sharing, listening, being empathetic. We are not innately born with that. We learn those skills, we develop those skills because other people do those things to us, and we have those shared experiences. And so that's a big piece of shifting into how do we implement this trauma-informed care, is really having the understanding that we have to recreate a different narrative in our schools, in our community-based organizations, in any of the interactions that we have with youth, that we need to create a different space where kids are learning that they do not have to be in this alert mental state and on the lookout for what's going to be happening next, right? That they can feel safe and a sense of belonging. They can trust the adults who are in their environment. And it takes a lot of time and exposing kids to that kind of treatment before they're going to start really feeling like they can be themselves and they can kind of let down some of those guards. The other piece I think it's really important to know is, not every child who struggles with some of these self-regulation skills, being able to interact with peers, has difficulty learning, has trouble focusing. They may not all have trauma histories. And I don't think us knowing their trauma histories is necessary information. But when we start looking at kids who are struggling as if they may have had these early experiences, it really changes how we as adults look at those children and how we create environments for those children. And so I think I'm sort of keeping that lens, as we like to say, sort of shifting to that trauma lens is really imperative, and looking at all kids as if they may have had these experiences, and we need to have the caring and safe environment for them, believing or understanding that they may have had these experiences, and we are really providing this counter narrative for them, this alternate experience. So the 5 trauma-informed care principles that we're really going to focus on are listed on the screen: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And I'm going to quickly go through these 5. I believe that I'm presenting till 11:30, and then there's time for discussion. So I don't want to shortchange these, but I do want to go through these and just give you some examples of what does safety look like in an environment? What does trustworthy look like in an environment? Choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And then I'll end with a little bit of information on the impact that this trauma-informed care has had on schools and environments that have implemented it over the last several years, and how this information can really help us to inform our conversations and help make the case for why this is so important in our communities. So safety is really a space where kids feel culturally, emotionally, physically safe. And we often think about safety as, no one gets hurt, it's a good day. But really we have to think about psychological safety, that kids feel like they're safe, that they don't have to be on high alert, right? That we are really much more available and supportive to kids. We are there to give them this sense of belonging, and that they can be authentically who they are in this space, and that we are going to accept them and care about them and nurture them in this space, regardless of the situation. That is really the primary foundation, I believe, in trauma-informed care, is just creating this space where people feel safe to be themselves. and that they know they are going to be cared for and nurtured. And that the adults who are in this space really consistently share the message of we care about you, right? We care about you, we care about your well-being, and we are here to support you. And create this space where you belong and where we want you to be. The next piece is trustworthy. And when we look at trustworthy, we think about consistency, right? Kids who have early adversity often live in very unpredictable environments, right? They don't know when the caregiver is going to be angry or not. They don't know when they're going to have food or not, right? So there's a lot of chaos and unpredictability. And I would argue that this last year, in all of our lives, we have lived in unpredictability, right? We've been living, and I'm a little bit tired of hearing the word unprecedented times, but we are living in unprecedented times. And think about, we don't know what to expect. We learn new things, day to day, week to week. Information, is coming to us, and we're taking it in as we go. And so we've all been living in sort of this unpredictable environment, which has caused some significant stress on many of us. So what we really need to counteract that is trustworthiness. We need predictability. We need routine. We need adults who do what we say and say what we do, right? We need adults who are consistent. We need to be adults that kids can rely on. So one of the examples that I talk about that was one of the areas of personal growth for me was when a child would come to me and say, I need to talk to you about something, and it was in the middle of passing time and classes were changing, and I had a whole group of kids coming to my room, and I would say to that child, I would really love to talk to you. I will get back to you, when I have a free period. And I would teach the next class, and my day would go on, and 10 other fires would pop up that I would be putting out, and at the end of the day, I never went back to that kid, right? And so I have just told that kid through my behavior that I am another adult that they can't count on, right? That I have to be accountable to that child, and I need to make sure that I go back and check in, because that child is reaching out to me saying, I trust you as an adult, and I need to talk to you about something that's important to me. And so in order to create this trust relationship, I need to ensure that I follow through with that child, and that I go back, I cycle back, and I say to that child, I see you, I validate you, you have something that you want to share with me, and I think it's important. And so we're going to have this conversation, right? So following up, doing what I say, saying what I do. That trustworthiness is essential, because abuse, neglect, living in very chaotic or unpredictable environments is really a theft of that trust. I cannot trust anything in my environment. And so we are rebuilding that in this environment. So when you are at school or when you are engaged with me, you can feel safe and you can trust me. You can trust what's going on in this environment. Incredibly powerful space for kids to walk in when outside of this space, they are experiencing very different things, right? When they're experiencing really the opposite of that. The choice is really giving kids some autonomy. Oftentimes, when we are victims of abuse, neglect, chronic stress, it's a theft of choice. We really don't have autonomy. We don't have the ability to say, this is what I want for me and my body, right? I lose the ability to do that. I lose my ability for choice. And so providing opportunities for kids to have choice and to have that sense of autonomy is incredibly powerful. So we as adults often work in directives, right? We often work in everybody sit down, everybody take out their books, everybody get in line. We're moving to this. And so some of those directives when we're working with an entire group, are important and are necessary in those environments. But when we have opportunities to give kids more than one way to get to where we want them, it's a good idea to provide that choice. Directives provide choice, but the choice is between yes and no. So if I say, everybody get out their books, and someone, a child is really feeling overwhelmed, and as if they have no control over what's going on with them in their environment, they may choose not to follow the directives. But if I give them a couple options for how they can get to where I want them to go, then they may be more likely to make one of those choices because it builds in that sense of choice and autonomy. So, it's math time. You can either, get out your book and stay at your desk, or you can come sit at this table. And we're going to, look at the next assignment or the next unit, or we're going to learn about multiplication, right? So I'm building in some opportunities for choice. And I love this image on this slide because I really feel like oftentimes when kids are given directives and they feel that sense that they don't have autonomy, we kind of get that face from them, right? Like the response to a command face, like, I don't know if I want to do what you're telling me I have to do. All right, our next principle is collaboration, and really thinking about the idea that all of this happens in relationship, right? That safety, that trustworthiness, all of that develops in a relationship, and that we have to build intentionally those positive relationships with kids. So I attended a conference a year, probably 2 years ago now. With the pandemic, I kind of lose track of time. It was in person, so it had to be more than a year ago. And I went to a session on trauma-informed care in public schools. And one of the things that they talked about, one of the interventions they talked about, was using something called the ARC model. And the ARC model is really a therapeutic response to trauma. It's attachment, regulation, and competency is what the ARC of the ARC model stand for. But they really focused on the attachment piece. And that attachment piece really speaks to relationship. And so what they did is they went into an elementary school and they listed all of the kids who attend that elementary school on a board in the teacher's lounge or a workroom. And then they gave all of the staff, custodians, administrative staff, principals, teachers, kitchen staff, everybody who set foot and worked in that building had dots. And so what they did is they looked at this list of every child who attended that school building, and they put dots by kids that they felt they knew pretty well. By reading the child's name, they knew who they were, they knew what they looked like, they maybe knew some information about them. They felt like there was a connection. And so after all of the staff had run through this dot activity, they looked at the kids that had no dots, or the kids who had very few dots. And so they then embarked on what they called an attachment intervention. And all of the staff were given information about these children who really didn't seem to be connected to any adults in the school building. And so it was the adults' responsibility to reach out and go out of their way to make connections with these kids. So to identify the kids who didn't have any dots, and when you saw them in the hallway, greet them by name. When you saw them in your classroom, chit-chatting with them, before the bell rang or after class, reaching out to them when you saw them in the cafeteria. And so the idea behind this attachment intervention is often kids who struggle and fall between the cracks are kids who are kind of invisible kids, right? They're the kids who aren't connected, they don't have a sense of belonging, they don't have a support system, they don't have adults who they feel like are really there for them. And so intentionally trying to create connections for kids who don't feel like they have that sense of connection is really what this collaboration is about. We've also talked about doing it in the inverse. So as I've presented this idea to other schools and other Boys and Girls Clubs and other youth serving agencies, we've talked about doing the inverse, listing all the adults in a facility and asking kids to identify what adults do they feel like are available and supportive for them. And it can be done anonymously. Kids don't have to put their name on it. But then you get a sense of, are there kids who turn in a blank sheet and tell you there is no one in this building who I feel like is in my corner? And that would give you the same information, right? And then you know as adults, you really need to step up your game and go out of your way to kind of create those relationships. And I find this one activity just incredibly powerful, because when you look at kids who drop out of school, who maybe start engaging in more violent behavior, they are often kids who will identify themselves as not fitting in and not really being connected. So I find this to be an incredibly powerful activity and a concept to think about as a school or any organization that's working with kids. And then the last principle is empowerment. So really looking for strengths, validating the strengths, helping to build those strengths, right? And we often look at challenging behavior as just a problem that we have to deal with, right? This kid is sassy and snotty and talks back, and I need to teach them that that's not okay. They need to be respectful of adults and their peers. The reality is that behavior serves them in some environment. That's why it has evolved. And maybe they're in an environment, where they have experienced neglect, and the only way for them to get their needs met in that environment is to speak up, right? And so that is an adaptive behavior in some environment. It's not adaptive in our school environment, but it is adaptive somewhere else. And so how do we look for the underlying strength of that behavior and build on that in our environment so that that underlying strength can be developed in a way that's going to be more effective for that child? So I really like the sassy example, because I was working with a middle school young lady who was extremely sassy. And she and I, kind of had a connection. We got along, we had a pretty good relationship. We could joke with each other. I think we really kind of started to build some of that, that connection, that collaboration, that trust, right? So that relationship was building. And so I started talking to her about her sassiness and how her sassiness was really self-advocacy, that she had this great strength of understanding what she needed and telling people and advocating for what she needed. The issue became she didn't always get what she wanted because of the way that she was self-advocating. And so we talked about what happened in the way she was currently self-advocating. And oftentimes she would get pushback from adults, right? And those adults would get upset at the way that she was talking to them. And so she and I would practice how to advocate in a way that would be more effective. So when you need something, how do you communicate that so that you get what you want more often? And she was interested in getting what she wanted more often or what she needed more often. And so, it was not a perfect process, right? It takes time, because if we think back to the brain that we were talking about, we are building those pathways. We are walking through knee-deep weeds, right? When we are shifting from, I am highly emotional and I am going to tell you to shut up and I need something to eat, right? Right now, I don't care what you're talking about and disrupt the class. I'm here. But when I'm going to start practicing more effective ways to communicate, I have to regulate, right? I have to be able to weed weed through those weeds to start building those pathways to say, I'm feeling hungry and I'm not able to focus. And so instead of going into this fight or flight, I need to recognize that and stay engaged and start practicing building those pathways. And so we did, little by little by little. And over the course of several months, she got better and better at advocating in a more appropriate way. Were there times that she sometimes, reverted? Absolutely. And when she reverted, instead of using punishment and using coercion, me saying, don't talk like that, that's disrespectful, right? I would say, oh, we slip back down. Let's remember, it wasn't punitive because she was building a skill. She was building a skill that she didn't have. Teaching a child multiplication tables, I'm not going to punish and yell at them if they haven't memorized their threes. But I'm going to try and help them with strategies to practice and develop and grow so that they can master those threes. It is the same thing. We have to look at this as skill building, and we are helping kids to build and develop those skills. Okay, I'm just looking at the clock. I like to talk. I apologize. It's 11:35. All right, so some simple things in action. Embedding staff in the cafeteria and sitting at the tables with the kids. We in schools really like to walk around the periphery like we're the parole officers and it's prison and these are our prisoners, right? So let's sit down and talk to kids and move around and have seats and engage and build relationship, right? So we're not building that power dynamic. We are building a collaborative dynamic. Building in time into our school day to focus on team building, social emotional learning, mindfulness. There was a school in either San Diego or San Francisco that instituted 10 minutes of mindfulness at the beginning of every single day. And they dropped their discipline referrals 75%. So just by helping kids who are coming from a very impoverished, violent, difficult neighborhood, helping them come into school and shift their mind out of that fear part of the mental state continuum and into the calmer part of the mental state continuum, they reduce their disciplinary action 75%. Meeting and greeting kids by name. I was a teacher for 12 years. I know some days you're flying, by the seat of your pants, you're trying to get everything together, you're making copies, you're running, but taking the time to be at the door when the kids are coming in and greeting them all by name. That is relationship building. Having a space in your classroom where kids can decompress if they're feeling overwhelmed, a chill zone. Having a place in your building where kids can go. Throw a kid in there who's having a tantrum and that's good. That is not good. The space, a child who is really overwhelmed and is dysregulated, just being put in a room by themselves, is not going to give them the skills to regulate. We need to teach them when they're in that space. We need to provide materials, manipulatives. We need to have sound and lights and rocking chair, or some other way that children can be rhythmic. We need to incorporate all of those. We need to have a protocol and a process for when kids use that room. We can't expect that kids are magically going to develop skills that they didn't have already just by putting them in a space to help them calm down. Building in brain breaks into our classrooms and our activities. I thought this was a genius idea. I heard about this from a high school in North Dakota. They play music over their PA during passing time, and they have a playlist of music that is 70 to 80 beats per minute. That is resting heart rate. And so you have this constant underlying beat that is playing in your building that mimics a resting heart rate. They saw disciplinary action during passing time go down significantly just by playing music during passing time. And then incorporating families in as many ways as you can in what is going on in school, what they know about their child, how they can help us to support their children. I will share all of these. I will share all of these links with you. Sorry, I have like a little mental problem there for a second, retrieving what I was trying to say. I'll share all these links with you, but these are articles that DPI has referenced as part of their trauma-informed care modules. Just looking at schools can lower their suspension rates and raise graduation rates by implementing trauma-informed care. What if everything you knew about disciplining was wrong? These negative consequence, timeout, punishment, it really makes things worse, especially for kids who have had early traumatic experiences. The high school in Walla Walla, Washington, if you've watched Paper Tigers documentary, this is the school that that's based on, how the ACE study impacted their school in an incredibly significant way. And then DPI also cited this trauma-sensitive school checklist. So you can kind of go through and look at what are some of the different aspects of trauma-informed care that I would want to implement as a school system in order to really look at how I'm doing. How am I doing implementing this? All right. And then I just posed some questions for a little bit of discussion time. And you can ask any questions about what we've discussed, but I was also thinking about, reflecting on your own community. What do you know about your own districts? Are they implementing all, some, none of some of what we've talked about? How can we support them in starting to discover what is out there and what schools can do to really help support kids across the board, but really with an eye on the kids who are really the most at risk and often really struggle the most in our school systems. How can we really make a difference for those kids? So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to some conversation. So Susan, if you're still in here, if you want, you could probably stop highlighting me. I think for the discussion, it would be nice if we could all see each other and maybe just have a conversation about our thoughts and our questions, ideas. What do we think?
I did remove your spotlight.
Thank you, thank you. So it's open. Anyone, thoughts, questions, comments? What do you think?
I think that this was very incredibly valuable information. So my name is Catherine and I run the LEO program, which is a resiliency program where we actually teach high schoolers about their brain, and we use the hand model of the brain and talking about how they can calm down that stress and that survival reaction to everyday stressors. And so this was just so incredibly helpful, and to see also how schools are really implementing trauma-informed practice and having that difference really be shown in the results coming from that was wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing this information and presenting today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for participating.
Hi, I'm Sue. I work at the Lackawanna School, and we do a lot of those practices. But what I was thinking, I guess, during the presentation was it would be nice if parents could hear this information so that they could then reinforce or use some things at home because of not knowing what to do or to deal with some of those behaviors. So I think that would be something to think about, us trying to get going.
That's a great point. That is a great point. And oftentimes parents, really are living what they know in their home environments. And so having some additional support and insight and giving parents some more strategies, I think would be really powerful. That's a great suggestion, Sue.
Hi, I'm Lanice. This is really awesome. I appreciate it because I do see that I'm a grandmother. My daughters are grown. As a grandmother, I do see this. I have grandchildren in the school system here, and I do see this going on where they're interacting, they're really concerned about the child's well-being. But what's so awesome about this is I get a chance to see how to be a part of, to help my grandchildren to be better, and they'll just be more successful in life by learning all of this. And I can see where I had some faults within these areas. And now I know better how to interact with my daughters so that they can interact with their children and they can be stronger individuals as they grow. So this is really awesome. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else with comments, questions, thoughts? Looks like there's something in the chat. So someone else, Paula said, yes, she agrees the parent aspect. So that might be the next piece is how do we start building, some information that's accessible to parents. I know that there are some organizations, excuse me, who have built, webinars and other types of resources for parents. But, my personal perspective is parents who are really overcommitted, who are really living in stressful environments, etc. That's the last thing that they're going to have time to do is sit down and watch a webinar. How can we meet parents in a way that's accessible and meaningful? And I think that's a great problem to start talking about and to try and tackle. How do we help support them in a way that's going to be meaningful and that they're going to use and be able to access?
Can I throw in one more thing? I'm sorry. And as a recovery coach, as a recovery coach, why it makes me see why it would be so awesome if it were more host sites for recovery coaches, and then it would be more exposure to these trainings and getting to help the people in addiction, because I'm a recovering addict and I can see the faults that I had with my children being there and not being there. So if it could be more host sites in the community, then it would be more coaches for them to be exposed to these trainings and get it out to the people. And then the mothers and the grandmothers could help and build the relationships in their homes. Just a thought I had, because by me being a coach, I'm able
that's
to
awesome.
see and be a part of this. So the more host sites, the more coaches and the more people will get the experience of these trainings. This would be so awesome for a lot of recovering addicts too.
Yeah, I can see that. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I do think it's a matter of, as we know better, we do better, right? And so as we learn about a lot of these strategies, then we understand the reasoning why this works or why we might have struggled with something else. And then it makes sense to us. Oh yeah, I can see why I should be trying this instead of, what I maybe would typically have reverted to in how I interact, with that, whatever the situation is with my children, my grandchildren, with, coworkers, peers, if I'm working in an organization with kids, right? So whatever space I'm occupying, it helps us to approach people differently. Any other questions, comments? Nobody else? I saw the original template was for a 60-minute presentation, a 30-minute talking about it. So I wanted to make sure that I gave some time for people to discuss, because I figure that was probably your normal framework. So. All right, well, if no one else has any questions, comments, or concerns, I don't have anything else to share at this point. So thank you all for participating and attending today. Hopefully the information was helpful and relevant. And if you are connected with staff from Marshfield Clinic Health System and you have questions or would like some more information, you can certainly reach out, to the Megan that we have, or Christina, whatever the case may be, certainly reach out to them, and they know how to get in touch with me, and we can have a conversation. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you very much, Jen, for being here with us today. It's a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.